since afterward costs nevertheless increase beyond what can sustain margins of solubility, industry is inevitably expatriated to other countries. Why does a tractor producer leave the United States and move to Mexico? Because it can get the same labor for 1/3 the cost, you see. So since that's the only avenue in which it can reduce its cost, it resorts to exploiting labor. Now, yes, that's not right. We can call it evil, and we might be absolutely correct in doing so. But the fact of the matter still is that the fundamental obfuscation of the currency required all this. Now, in the case of corporations, I don't really see the corporate entity itself as inherently evil, and I don't see that it is necessarily compelled to do this. I know that people in certain corporations actually have stellar reputations for doing their utmost to, despite the fact that owing to the inadequacies of management of a corporation, all hell would be breaking loose. But the corporate employees take responsibility for the integrity of their products and the stellar performance and powers and virtues of their products. So, nonetheless, because this obfuscation of the currency transmits so much wealth to the central banking system, and because that wealth is wielded by people who are motivated to take unearned profit without limit, what inevitably happens is you will have the same people or their close associates who are responsible for this evil thing, evil obfuscation of the promissory obligation, which is actually one of the most destructive things which has ever been created in history. Destructive and unjustifiable things which have ever been created in history.
Okay, so I think we agree.
Well,
sorry, go on, carry on, Mike.
When you have them saturated with more wealth or representations of wealth, quote unquote money, than they know what to do with, they're going to become major owners of not only corporations, but they're going to buy currency, they're going to buy commodities, they're going to do all of the things which are so destructive to us. And so in the end of this thing, as it multiplies artificial indebtedness to terminal extents, and you have this need to reflate the circulation, these guys become the owners of everything, either by dispossession or outright buying or whatever. But because they seek what they do without principle and without limitation, and are so empowered to take it in every way, this is why the world is the way that it is. Go ahead.
Okay. So we obviously agree that the banking system itself in its current and past forms is definitely bad for us. So unless there's something else that you want to cover as far as the history is concerned, or maybe the current, what I might want to switch over to is ask you questions about now what the alternative fixes are for this problem. Of course, mathematically perfected economy is your number one choice, but of course there are many other proponents of monetary reform out there, not least of which Ron Paul and Stephen Zarlinga. Alan Brown is a proponent of state banking with, again, some interest attached to it. Can we maybe discuss the... well, let's start with Ellen, because I've spoken with her recently. She is the proponent of state banking with some interest associated or attached to loans, basically to cover for defaults, because no matter what, she believes that defaults will still occur and we still have to deal with the free money.
If you have interest, interest is the cause of the default. So you preserve the cause of defaults, you're going to have defaults. So, that sort of rules her out pretty quickly. Now, I'm quite familiar with Ellen's, ever vacillating positions. She's all over the map. But in truth, when you bring up Zarlinga, and we can add a million names to these, G. Edward Griffin, Edward Flaherty. Do you know who he is?
Actually, I don't know that one. I've heard, obviously, of Ed Griffin and many others.
That's because he disappeared a long time ago. He was a professor of a university in the southeast of the United States, so in the early 90s. And back then, of course, my pages were the only monetary reform presence on the Internet, and you did any search for the Federal Reserve and whatever, my pages ranked number one, even above the Federal Reserve itself. And, of course, even then, that was 10 years after I first appeared on what eventually became the Internet, because, of course, I released, the computer models and documentation that I produced for the Reagan administration, which documentation proved a thesis of inevitable failure and singular solution. And so, from the beginning, and actually this extends to clear back to 1968, mathematically perfected economy is a product of a actual mathematic proof of singular solution. Now, this fellow Flaherty was a professor, and I don't recall what university he taught at, and he had a website that popped up a couple years after the formal beginning of the Internet, and if I believe I recall correctly, the name of his pages was Federal Reserve Conspiracies Debunked. And what happened, I did notice his pages at one time. I frankly found them not just preposterous, but about as irritating to anyone who was interested in the truth as irritating could be. And what happened was, after quite some while, I heard over some span of time from several of his students, and they claimed that, he basically taught that the Federal Reserve was this entirely beneficent entity that only served the people. It was responsible for all our industrial expansion and so on and so forth. And these students asked me about my ideas. And as people find who write me, I'm quite accessible, and I give qualified answers, and of course my pages embody this mathematic proof of inevitable failure and singular solution, and his students were quite impressed with it. Well, after about a year or so, I started getting not just a fairly regular email from his first, semester or two of students who had written me, but a substantially increasing number of his further students, who all of whom were entirely convinced that I was absolutely right. And of course, if I weren't right, it's an incredibly remarkable coincidence that the models I provided the Reagan administration, which merely reborrow principal and interest as is necessary to maintain a vital circulation, projected all the debt that we would accumulate and an inevitable failure at approximately 2010 AD from 1980s data in 1983 and 84, And, of course, these students are writing me 10 years later. So a year and a half or two, I'm getting so many emails from this person's, students that I decide, as I often am forced to do, to kill every bird with one stone. So I put up a page. This person's name, Edward Flaherty, debunked. His page was Federal Reserve Conspiracies Debunked, and he purported in a paragraph or two to have debunked my website, in the same manner that G. Edward Griffin and this fellow William B. Ryan of the so-called Capital Ownership Group of Kent State University had attempted to debunk my work by saying, and these papers that in which I invalidate their attempts to disprove just a cause of failure that mathematically perfected economy solves. I have articles, of course, still online about all these things. So I produced a like response to Edward Flaherty, and I titled the page Edward Flaherty Debunked. This is years before Stephen Zarlinga or even Jacques Jacaran ever even appeared on the scene. I was the first guy, and I was there as a I'm not going to say I'm a mathematic genius, because I've forgotten far more math than most people were ever learned. But I was considered a mathematic genius as even as a young child, and this idea of mathematically perfected economy is no casual idea. It's as if and I was doing things like proving the Pythagorean theorem off the top of my head. There aren't many people that can do those kinds of things, and yet, then when I say, in effect, that the square of the hypotenuse equals the sum of the square of the sides, and I've proven this, then we have Stephen Zarlinga and Jacques Jacaran and Ellen Hodgson Brown come along, who are not even serious mathematicians or authors of solution, who say, oh no, a solution can be this, or oh no, a solution can be that. Well, what happened in the case of Edward Flaherty, all his students I made it wasn't just critical, it was a little bit humorous, but it really made quite an ass of this person who was claiming that the Federal Reserve is, the glory of mankind, and without, justifying a single ostensible principle, including particularly the fundamental nature of money, as we did in the beginning of this discussion here. Well, anyway, so that page got a lot of traffic. Evidently, quite a lot of the students of that school spread the word, And I'm sure it wasn't just the quote-unquote economics students that eventually came to that page and learned a lot from it, I hope. Then I forget what his official position was, but the president of the university eventually writes me. And he says, Dear Mr. Montagne,